Welcome back to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Seth, do it.
Good morning and a happy Tuesday, gentlemen.
There it is. Well, I have a little bit of bittersweet news here. I guess it's bittersweet. This might be your last happy Tuesday you'll hear on the podcast.
Well, I hope so. Because that nobody should take that from me.
No one should take that. We'll have to snip out a couple audio clips here. There's some announcements coming. Things are changing on the Explicit Measures podcast. Seth, we'll give it over to you. You have some announcements you'd like to make.
Yes, there is an announcement. This is my last episode on the Explicit Measures podcast.
Wow. So,
kind of at the end of this year, a catalyst of change came about, and I'm no longer part of Power BI.tips. And kind of contributing and owning to that brand and bringing value to it was a main driver for motivation for the podcast for me. And kind of without that, I have a chance to reevaluate my time investments. So it kind of falls into a little bit of introspection, but time is our most precious asset. I've spent over 10 years devoting a ton of that time to technology and Power BI. It's been great. It's been rewarding, but there are sacrifices that have to be made in other areas of life, obviously.
Yep.
And I think it's just given me some time to reflect and figure that I want to spend some more time devoting some time to those and give myself a break, figure out what other areas I want to contribute to in the future. So for the time being, I'm going to spend some more time on my faith, my family, fitness, and friends. I realize all of those are F's. And we'll see what happens in the F future.
With your F SKUs.
Yeah, with my F SKUs. But, as an intro, I do want to thank you guys for great conversations and being part of this experience. It's obviously been great. And I want to thank our listeners and those that submitted questions and joined us in chat and were part of the conversation. You made this a much better experience for me, and I enjoyed the journey that we had. That all being said, the Explicit Measures podcast lives on. You guys are continuing on next Thursday, albeit with a bit of a change.
A bit of a change.
Wow.
So, Seth, I just want to say thank you. It's been a blast. You pretty much pulled me into the community space of this whole stuff anyways. I have to give you mad props of you pulled me in as an MVP. You pulled me into all these things inside the Power BI ecosystem. It's been a fantastic ride. So I can't thank you enough. And also, I've loved the conversations and the perspective you bring to the Explicit Measures podcast. It's been super fun. We really appreciate all the time that you've hung out, spent with us, those early mornings, those weeks of time where we had to record like 1,000 episodes as we prepare for holidays and breaks and people traveling. So I do want to appreciate all the hard work you put into this one. And it's been a thoroughly fun and enjoyable ride. Best wishes on your new adventures and where things go. Maybe our paths will cross again. Who knows? I don't know where things will land, but you never know.
Do I get special guest access anytime I want to come back?
I think so. I think that's
Can he
after doing this for 4 years. After doing this for 4 years, I'm pretty sure special guest access is always welcome. This is, I mean, you've done it for so long. Yes, I would easily admit to that on the podcast. You get immediate special guest access if you have things. When you go over to Tableau now and
No. You're the only person who will be allowed to interview Seth. Seth and I want to say too, as shocking as this is for everyone here, this podcast, you've challenged me. You have not been afraid to argue. And it's really what I honestly love to do in all my endeavors. And you've really made me attempt to really expand my opinion, my thoughts, and my point of view in so many things in Power BI, and not coming from a place of contention, but truly, okay, you have that idea. Can you back it up? And you've challenged me live. You've challenged me offline, but mostly live kind of thing. But it's always going to be good fun. And Seth, the way you have discussed, pondered, and gone through over 385 hours basically of conversation is really the heart of why we started the podcast in the first place. Again, I'll always say this, the reason why we're actually even doing this was we had a conversation just as friendly, and we saw how we engaged. But more importantly, we really knew that there was nothing in our space about the gray area, but the reality is always like, well, how to build a report, how to do a visual,
Yep.
all those other things that we've dealt with. You've led that through so much. So I want to thank you. I am sorely going to miss you because it's always nice having 3 too, because you can always gang up on someone.
And sadly, Tommy's been pretty much the one that we gang up on the most. Usually, that's usually it feels like it has been in the podcast. So
At least it'll be somewhat 50-50 now.
I need to find another kindred soul to help me gang up on Tommy. That's what I need.
You better be ready to debate.
Oh boy, here we go.
So Seth, I just want to thank you. It's been an honor. It's been awesome. And like I said, even if no one listened to this, the last 4 years, I would do over again.
It's been fun. It's been definitely mark it up as part of the story, right? The experience of life.
Yep.
And I think with that, we're gonna end our last episode talking about Excel.
Something Excel. Yeah. So with that, let's get into Seth's strong suit here. Is an area we our main topic for the rest of this episode will be just kind of talking about migrating Excel reports to Power BI reports, or doing a migration from Excel to Power BI visualizations, reporting, whatever you want to call it, and just kind of the challenges that we face when we go through these migrations, or when we've been given an Excel sheet, we want to mirror it or build the same thing inside Power BI. So why migrate Excel to Power BI? What are the challenges there? That'll be our topic for today. But before we get into our main topic, we do actually have one announcement. Microsoft has been very much slowing down on the output of blogs or content or things, because they take off for the holidays as well. And so we typically don't get a release or any kind of new big information until mainly through January. December and January are usually the time things go quiet. And then we get into February and we get another release, and releases start kicking in again. But Tommy, you found a topic today for news. There is a R and Python visuals in Power BI. Important update coming to R and Python visuals in Power BI. You're kind of noting here.
Yeah, so we haven't really seen a lot of updates from the Microsoft team about the Python and R visuals. It looks like they're finally updating Python and R to be obviously what's going on. I think it's going to be Python 3.11 compared to what it was before, which was just an old version. Another topic for another day, but I would be interested if you've been ever dabbled around with the Python visuals or the Python scripts, and if there are any of you have it in your production report. I've had a few in my sandboxing, but nothing that I've actually released to a client or to consumers. So just kind of interesting there.
Yeah, I'll also, I mean, Tommy, to kind of finish off your point there as well. I've played with the R and Python visuals because their interactions are very limited. They don't really do as much as what you need them to do related to interactivity or clicking on things and having data being cross-filtered from the visual back into the report side of things. I have found very limited use cases for R and Python visuals. It's nice. It's handy. You can write code to build a visual, which is nice. But other than just playing around with the feature, I don't really use them in production very much. There's not a lot of extra effort there. If I'm trying to use or build a more elaborate visual, I'm using things like Charticulator and Deneb, honestly, to be frankly honest. Those go into production more frequently than I have been using R and Python. But the fact that it exists and it is there are certain visualizations you may want to pull through. Another opportunity here as well with R and Python visuals is in notebooks. You can add visuals, and you can actually add notebooks into organizational apps. So if you do need visuals as a part of a story of data, you can incorporate them into notebooks as well, and not necessarily a Power BI report. So it'll be interesting to see where this R and Python update is going to go. Looking forward to seeing the developments here. And I think you're right, Tommy. It's worthy to point out that some of the updates are coming. If you are using them, you'll get some newer tools. You'll get the newer versions of code to update and build some different visuals. So anyways, just want to point that out. No other really major announcements coming out at this point. So other than that, let's get into our main topic today.
I mean, we could spend time just going through all of the libraries.
All the libraries.
That could be a fantastic end episode.
Riveting.
Python AST tokens version 2.4.1. Certify version 202.8030. I can keep going.
Is this the best use of our time with the use of our time with Seth and his final hours we have with us? I don't think so. NumPy now updated to 2.0.0.
I didn't see any gluten in here, so I saw glue. I don't know if that's a Python library, but it's R.
Anyways, good information. I just put the link of that it's actually in the description, but it's also in the chat window as well. So if you want to go check that out, there's more documentation there on the Microsoft website around that update as well. So it'll be interesting to see what the community does. To be frankly honest, I have not seen the community, or like, when I mean community, I scan across Reddit, I scan across LinkedIn, I hang out on Twitter. Those are the 3 places that I play and watch the community. I don't see many people building visuals in R and Python. So if you're usually like, oh, interesting, should I do this? I don't think you should spend a ton of time on this unless you have a very specific use case. That being said, let's move over to our main topic, Tommy. Want to give us a little run up here, Tommy? What are you thinking for this topic? We're talking Excel. We're talking migrating things from Excel into Power BI reporting or models. Let's unpack this.
Yes. I think we need to give this a little more love. And I don't know if you guys have ever been in a situation where there was a Excel report, and we'll call it a report in the most liberal sense, but the data was structured, cleaned, and formatted nicely and styled in an Excel file. And it looked nice with some tables, maybe a few visuals, but really it's however it's getting the data into that final version. That's what a team or department uses or relies on to see what their numbers are. I've seen this for sales teams to see the quote. I've seen this for product inventory. It's always updated once a day. And the configuration behind this is not going to be the conversation today, but usually it's macros and a lot of formulas and a lot of additional Excel sheets, a lot of advanced usage to get that final cleaned up Excel vision. A lot of times when organizations are really trying to make that data culture change, they want to move obviously off of those Excel files. It's tedious, takes a lot of time. But the problem is Excel migrations to Power BI reports, as seamless or as easy as that would sound, in practice, man, what a headache. There are so many gotchas that you may have to deal with besides automation. But one of the big things for me is the consumers or the audience's expectations, what Power BI can do compared to what they can do in Excel, and then changing their mindsets. So anytime you, I kind of want to just start there, kind of lay the groundwork. Have you guys ever done this? Where do you feel Excel is now?
Well, Excel is an official database from Microsoft. So let's start there, right? I mean, it is a full-blown database. You can use it to do, this is totally sarcasm at this point. This is not true. Excel should not be a database. But to your point, Tommy, I have worked on many projects where Excel is acting as if it is a pure database. It is all the things. All the data comes loaded in. I've even had customers build a whole bunch of Access databases that pull from a SQL server, aggregate data down in order to get it loaded into Excel documents. So SQL Server to Access, Access to Excel, bring in lots of tables and build full reporting off of that, because the tooling that they had at their disposal did not allow them to have lots of records. So yes, I have definitely dealt with these projects, and I'll maybe highlight a couple areas where I think there's some friction here. And I think, Tommy, to your point, towards the end there is a mind shift that needs to happen between what I'm thinking about in Excel and then what I'm trying to do in Power BI. Excel lets you build tables and cell level information on top of your Excel elements. When you're in Power BI, we're actually talking about like modeling the data. So you kind of need all the data to be kind of loaded. And then once the data is there, then you can manipulate, shape, adjust, and refine that data. Another thing that I think is interesting that changes in people's minds here a little bit is the volume of data can be very different. In Excel, we have limitations around how much volumes of data you want to bring into the Excel sheets themselves, because the calculations run slower. I've done one sheet where we had 250,000 rows of data, of physical data, but then we had 13 columns of calculations. Well, if you do 13 times 250,000 rows, you're getting millions of calculations that need to run that are interdependent on each other. And if you don't build your Excel sheet correctly, it will take hours for it to recompute all the information that it needs. That doesn't necessarily get the same effect that you have in Power BI. So you can pre-calculate a lot more things or in the memory of the computer, which is highly faster. It's much faster than doing it in Excel. However, it comes with its own set of unique challenges. So I think those are my two talking points here. There's probably a lot of other things here that, Excel uses other data points or other things here as well. So I'll just kind of leave it there. Seth, maybe any interactions you've had around working with Excel or bringing Excel users into the Power BI world? What challenges have you faced or observations have you seen there?
Yeah, I think there's two aspects of it. And Tommy, you said you didn't want to touch on it, but I think it's a major part of migrating folks from Excel into Power BI when feasible, when it's a good fit. The first front end is sometime, well, they're both the hardest, right? Because it's the difference between saying that there are different data sets that your direct data access to individuals of seeing the raw data dumps and then they do something versus what you're trying to do with aggregated visualizations is just get the insight. I want to look at something and have the answer, as opposed to get the data, then have to go pivot, or then have to go do my own things, or then have to do my analysis on a row by row level. And I think that's where Power BI increases the value to organizations, because by having those conversations, folks don't need to look at the raw data all the time. But that's such a challenge sometimes in and of itself when folks have access to raw data. For some reason, what's interesting to me is I think if you're not familiar with looking at reports or building visualizations out of your data, it's a very uncomfortable shift for some people to not have access to the raw data. Because it's a thought process to get to a visualization, right? I want to look at my data and do these things with it. I want this information out of this large data set. And I don't think people have had enough of that experience in seeing the impacts of looking across a year worth of data and seeing a line change, as opposed to trying to suss it out by themselves by looking at all the raw data points. So I think first and foremost, that is one of the big shifts in conversation, that before you go all in on a migration out of Excel, because I think the easiest part to do is just integrate with the data that's coming out of the fully formed product that they're producing and start to bring forward some of the insights, right? Take the data set that they built in Excel, part one, teach them that hey, here's, after talking with these folks, everybody's pivoting things in this way. Here's the insights that you're trying to drive. Here's what we want to do from a report visualization standpoint. And that doesn't mean that we can't do tables and matrices, etc. Right? It's what are the enhancements you can bring, and sell them on the enhancements before you go first and fix all the data engineering stuff, which is where I think most of the value comes when you're going down these projects.
I like your points here, and I'm taking some notes here on my side, on my screen here, just to kind of point out a couple things I think you're highlighting, Seth. If I had to articulate the design path of reporting or visuals or things in Excel, I think it would go to, I think, what you were speaking to, Seth. The design path is see raw data dumps, look at the data inside Excel sheets, figure out what's there, shape the data in Excel, deleting rows, cleaning data, fixing things, right? And then start focusing on what kind of information can be aggregated into a visual, an aggregation of data. I think, to your point, we skip a lot of that, see the raw data portion, and see that experience of shaping the data. I think Power Query serves a lot of that. And I think another aspect of this that I think is underutilized in general, many Excel users don't understand Power Query exists. It's there. It's an automation tool that helps you shape and clean data. That seeing the raw data dump, getting the data in, and then being able to shape and clean that data for preparation and whatever the report portion is I think is not used enough. It's an unknown feature, and that's one of the things I like to explain when I'm doing things in Power BI. When we show them people loading data sets in, look, this is the same Power Query engine that we have in Excel. And actually, I'll go do a demo of, watch me build this load of data using Excel. I'll load data in using Excel, and I'll do the one button press, import that same Power Query experience directly into Power BI. So like, look, if you just start working in Power Query initially, when you load your data, one, it'll go much faster. Two, you can load a lot more data. But then once you're done with this experience, if you like what you've done here and you want to migrate over to Power BI, it's literally one button, and it takes all the Power Query language and migrates it for you, which is, people love that. They're like, oh, wow. So it's a lot easier than I was thinking. Anyways, some thoughts there.
So from the data integration point, it is not necessarily terrible to get the data in, but what I have always run into is these Excel projects that we're trying to migrate.
Mhm.
It's the manual side of this that is more than just, that pivot tables and Power Query, importing that to Power BI is great. But a lot of these legacy Excel reports are based on so many manual processes with individual knowledge on what has to happen at certain times, that you run into where that report can only be done in the current process. But if it was manual, not necessarily, just getting the data in and we're going to turn a table into a visual. The biggest problem I find is how many hands touch the Excel data before it gets to that final form. And this happens on a weekly or monthly basis, cadence. And it's amazing how much time spent, but it's all this manual configuration. No, we're going to adjust this. I'm going to edit the cell because this cell, sets off a bunch of other numbers that, dare I say, in that form can't be done in Power BI. Power BI is databases, semantic model, structured tables. Excel can take anything. It doesn't have to be a log of CSVs. Too many times, the first phase of those Excel reports is someone going to the input Excel table where they're just inputting the aggregate numbers into, not in a, what we would think is columns and rows, but B1 and C1. Basically, that is very hard for us to convert. The hardest thing that I found was always, where did that data come from? Seth, you have the floor.
Yeah, but I think what the points you're making are why in the past, or why organizations go down this route of moving away from Excel. Because of the first points you're making, you're producing a data output that you have unknown inputs, you have unknown manual interventions, you don't know how this data set is getting put together. And I think fundamentally that's one of the drivers for BI teams to be or get engaged with business units. Because if you're talking about all the things we talk about all the time, Tommy, like trust in your data, where does it come from? What are the things? Like, that's why I think teams go in and say, okay, we want to automate this process. We want to make sure that the data inputs that we're getting, that we're driving business decisions on, are not predicated on somebody manually putting together a file that also, by the way, takes a lot of time to do. And I think that's one of the big ticks here as well, is the speed to delivery for a report, right? More often than not, and it happens to be more of the complex implementations that I've dealt with in the past with Excel, is you're in there with bringing some different levels of process improvement, because a team takes 2 to 3 weeks to put together the data for a report. And if we can come in and say, hey, we're pretty sure we can turn this around in a couple days most, or it's refreshed automatically whenever you want it, or at the end of the month, or at the end of the quarter, whatever. You don't have to wait, because in a lot of those times you're talking about financial data, you're talking about how fast we can make decisions based on the results of sales or our financial, aspects of things. And I think that's the driver for why you get into this. But what is, like, when you dive into these projects, it's all of these things that I think in general business folks aren't thinking about their data in the same way that we are, right? And Tommy, a lot of the things that you're saying that are challenges to automation are because people don't think about automating their workflows or their data flows in the way that they should be. So very often, like 90+% of everything that's happening in an Excel file can be a Power Query step. It can be some sort of transformation, shaping, etc. And in the cases where you need some sort of manual input, like in my experience, that's always been able to be something that's a one-off table or a configuration table or something else that drives impacts to other things. Automating and getting all of this to a place where we can, one, create a repeatable process, something that can scale, that we can automate, and others can use, I think is why you drive into these kind of migrations from an Excel into Power BI for cases that make sense. But it is an investment because it's not like, I think the misconception here is all of this data engineering and process is the time consuming part of it. It's understanding all of the things that are happening that are both manual and built into the Excel documents is sometimes extremely challenging to like dive all the way deep into and then kind of re-platform on Power Query, right? And to your previous point, and then I'll shut up, is it has always astounded me that Power Query was in Excel for forever. And I think it just proves the point that most business folks don't think in that way. Because if they had, they'd be looking at Excel going, how can I automate my processes, right? It's the cell by cell problem that I think we're trying to solve with re-platforming, as well as, giving better insights to business users.
I think another aspect of it. So Seth, I love all these points. I think I'm going to kind of add to some of these points of things that I've observed as well. I think another challenge that you're speaking to, Seth, or talking a little bit around the periphery of is, like, Tommy, to your point a second ago, the reuse of the Excel output is extremely challenging, right? So let's say I get to a place where I have a pivot table. I get to a place where I've shaped or processed the data. What then happens to that output? Like, how do you share that Excel document with other teams? Where does that output go to visualize or to actually become an output of that element? You share the Excel file. It gets emailed around. It gets stuck on a shared drive. It's like, it becomes like this physical thing that is now then handed around the company. And when it does that there's a high risk of where you get the final underscore final v1 v2 thing going, like, joke that comes from, because that's, you don't want to break the existing Excel sheet because it's so complicated already, but I need a new one. And at some point you run out of memory limits. Excel has actual limitations in it that, like, things go slow. So I can't tell you the number of projects I've been pulled into. They're like, hey, can you help us build a better Excel thing? We're doing this really complex data transformation. And if you think about, like, the company's lens of data, the data lens is large. It's millions of records across hundreds of customers or thousands of customers. The data volume could be immensely large on these companies, but they're not putting themselves in a place where Power BI, or now even at this point Fabric, can help them. So what happens is, instead of looking at all the customers' data, we build an Excel document that has, like, a flag or a switch or some input that lets you change from customer 1 to customer 2 to customer 3. So I can then load. So now I have, I take my 1 mega big Excel document, and instead of making a single model of the data, what are my inputs? What are my outputs? Stepping back and saying, what is the process of, like, what is the methodology I'm using to build this data process? It now turns into this, well, I can only use this Excel file for this particular customer. And so now you start building these smaller Excel files that are manageable, have reasonable amounts of speed. And I'll use this as another analogy here. Like, the refreshes inside Excel typically take much longer than what you'd be building in Power BI, because you spend the extra time automating how do you get the data in a regular fashion. To Seth's point earlier, and I have a lot of thoughts on this. There's so many thoughts here. The inputs of data. So when you want to have an input screen, Power BI is not good at that, honestly, frankly. Like in Excel, you can have multiple Excel input fields that then change how the calculations work on subsequent pages. You can do that in Power BI, but it's just not as easy. There's no input text box. There's no input number box in Excel where you can easily type in a number and just have information appear, and it just works throughout the rest of the Power BI report. That's just not a function of what they're doing inside Power BI reporting. It's not there. So I think there's all these little aspects and things. And in my observation of Excel, the more complex your Excel document becomes, the more we try and solve those things that are slowing down. We do more things with macros. So macros now start showing up in Excel to then pick up tables of data, shape it, bring it and put it back down. Like all these macro, hey, this Excel sheet's really slow. Okay, well, someone in our team built in a macro that will now pick up all the data, reprocess it, and then put it down somewhere else. So that's, again, to your point, Seth, Excel buries a lot of business logic into the Excel sheets or workbook that then gets very hard to extract and give to another team member or automate in a large fashion. My opinion is a lot of what Excel is doing is discovering what to do with the data, right? I don't want to ever poo-poo the idea of like saying, hey, we're getting rid of your Excel. That's not what I'm trying to say here. All I'm trying to say is Excel has its limits. Like I'd rather have you in Excel figure out how does the data come in? What are your inputs? How do you shape the data? What should be the output of the data, right? That's great to use in Excel, but do that on a very small window of data. And then once you understand it, let's talk about how we rebuild that process in an equivalent Power BI feature. And that will likely increase the number of records to a higher level, millions or tens of millions of records or more. You can handle a lot more in Fabric and Power BI. So I think there's this idea of like scale that comes with this as well. Back to you, Tommy.
So obviously, I think we're all in agreement in terms of Power BI is better for automation. Great. I kind of want to slightly shift to where that other disillusionment is with Power BI reports, especially for those heavy Excel teams. What honestly, truly is the hardest part of the Excel migration is the interactivity or ability to interact with the Excel file for the consumer that they cannot do in Power BI, or to try to get the same view. I believe our good friend Kurt Bueller had an article about this once where never take an Excel basically report and try to copy paste that into Power BI from a visual point of view. It just can't be done. And I think that's one of the hardest things, because Power BI is great for obviously the analytics side of things, but what people are probably used to in Excel and what teams are used to in Excel is maybe I can quickly update a number. I click on these three buttons, it, run some macro or some automation so I can get something shown a different way. And Power BI is pretty set in his ways. And again, a lot of things we do is the visualization. Let me ask before I give my opinion here, but when you find teams who are heavy and dependent on those Excel like tables and reports, do you find it hard to help communicate to them or really kind of move them towards a Power BI visual point of view rather than just creating a Power BI report with just a bunch of tables, trying to replicate what they had in Excel?
Well, let me before I want to go down that, like that seems like a very specific question. I want to kind of generalize your question maybe a little bit here, and maybe step back a little bit and look more high level at what we're talking about here. If I had to think about the things that are occurring inside Excel, there's probably more areas, but I'm thinking just in this conversation, just now I'm pulling these out of my head. 4 areas we should think about, right? There's one around like data engineering, right? How do I shape the data? What shape of the data does it transform from raw form to what I can start using it? So there's a data engineering aspect of this that comes in Excel and Power BI. There's this idea of automation in both tools, right? Excel can automate things, Power BI can automate things. What does that look like for you? And then there's I think what you're talking here next, Tommy, is the UI UX experience. What does the user interface look like? How am I presenting the data in front of those users, either in table form or in visual form? There's an experience. There is even inputs, right? So what input fields am I using to shape and modify that data? And then the last part of this I'll point out is there's another aspect of this world that's sharing. How do you share that information, right? And I think you could grade both Power BI and Excel in all of these areas. And I would argue that the data engineering side of things is much richer inside Power Query and inside Fabric. And I'm going to pull Fabric into this too, because I think we're not, even though we're not talking Power BI and other things, but I think Fabric adds a lot of data engineering capabilities, that automation of things that really make this extremely powerful for us. So that one is very relevant there. The reason I bring this up is because there's more and more systems are becoming like API driven. I have to go talk to this API and get data out of it. I'm seeing more and more use cases where this is occurring. Excel's not good talking to APIs and getting JSON files out and shaping them, unless you're going to go right into Power Query. So I think you could grade the data engineering part like that. To me, that's a win for Fabric and Power BI. Talk about the automation. Yes, Excel has automation in it, but I think a lot of that business logic gets landed in macros, Excel cells. And I've been in Excel sheets where the formula for a single Excel cell is like 40 lines long, 100 lines long in that one cell. And I'm thinking to myself, this is like when I just look at it, if you have hundreds of cells across different sheets that are like many, many lines deep and using lots of functions in there to do very complex, awesome. But who's going to maintain that? Only the person who created it can understand and know what that's doing. Or if you're going to give it to somebody else, they're going to need a lot of time to understand what was built there so they can utilize it. It's not as straightforward. So I think the automation side, yes, it's okay, but I also would give another win to Power BI in that space. UI UX, I think if you're going to grade Power BI and Excel in that space, I'm going to give the win to Excel for like input parameters or inputting data and having that incorporated into your analysis. I think Excel does better there. I think Excel also does better in table views of things. That's the golden standard for table building, in my opinion. Why Power BI hasn't been upgraded to match the same level of capabilities in Excel at the table level, that's beyond me. Another challenge I have found around the UI UX side of things is in your tables, when you want very specific cell by cell formatting, like this cell number turns into this number, therefore it should be this particular formatting or coloring. The formatting and conditioning of the table information is way richer inside Excel than it is in Power BI. So that's another win, I think, in my base for Excel. Where I give Power BI the length or the leg here is when you're talking about visuals, bar charts, other charts, line charts, and the interactivity between data. In Excel, it's very difficult to get a chart to click on data in one chart and have another chart change and show the data dynamically there. So the UI UX experience, like when I look at Power BI, I think of I'm building data products, as opposed to Excel, I'm building like a table, or I'm building like a very finite analysis. And then the last part I'll just give is the sharing part. I would give that a huge win to Power BI. So sharing is much easier in Power BI. It's designed to build around data products that you're going to produce. It has org apps, it has regular apps, like all these other things are going to make it easier for you to distribute that content out to other people. So that's maybe, I don't know, maybe I took your question a bit of the wrong way, Tommy, here, but I think grading the tools in those areas, they definitely have their strengths, but I think more of the strengths lend itself to moving more towards Power BI.
Yeah, I think I'd answer with a smaller subset of that, where Tommy, I think to me, your question delves into one of the hardest challenges around going from Excel to Power BI, right? Which is you're taking end users out of a space where they've learned over time how to change data through manual work or some Excel automation that they can like trigger, right? So they get a raw data set, they need to analyze and manipulate it. But if end users don't know the data engineering steps, these aren't meaningful to them. They just know the data, right? They just know that like they're going to do this thing. They've developed some formulas to transfer it. And then in advanced scenarios, they start getting into macros or some sorts of automation, but they need to be shown. And I think as much as I say, like, hey, like, show the insights that can come out of those results in the data sets, I think the biggest selling point that I've seen to teams of people is saying, hey, you guys, this takes you 3 weeks to do. It's not a criticism that it takes you 3 weeks to do. We're not saying that you're not doing good work there, but let's break down what it is you're doing and then show them the value of what would happen if you go down the paths of saying, we know we can automate 90% of your process. What that automation means is, like, we set this up and something else triggers a refresh on a cadence. You don't have to touch it, right? And that back and forth between, that automation versus, in some cases, there still needs to be manual input, right? There may still be some analysis that has to be done that Excel is great at, because there's cell by cell, row by row. You can change and manipulate data. There could be a base level set of data that needs to go into the engine, right? But if an end user goes from a 3-week process to, hey, I just got my raw data dump file, I'm going to do I'm going to do my analysis on it, and then I'm going to save my file to this location. I know that tomorrow it's going to be up and ready for the organization. And I think across all of those cases, there's always been a huge drive, once people know the direction they're going, to get on board with it, right? And you need them on board, because not only are you changing their process from like super manual to automation, you're kind of forcing Power Query and a new engine and a new way of doing things. So they have to learn and adopt that. And they're not going to learn and adopt it unless you show them the business value to them.
Mm-hmm.
The trade-off there is why you're doing this, and pushing away a fear that comes with that is, when you've got folks that have spend all their time in Excel, you've got to interject this this thought that your manual data manipulation that you do over and over and over is not value to the business. The value is in your analysis, or the value is in you doing more types of analysis that you don't have time for right now and can't produce. And that's why we're going down this path of trying to automate your workflow. It's not automating you. You're not at risk, right? Typically they're not. So it's what is the value to them in automation, and then show them the other things that they could do, which are on their backlog. And a lot of times that's in conversation, like, hey, you're doing all these things. What are you not getting to in a day? What are the things that the business keeps asking you to do that you just don't have enough time for?
Yep.
Those are the things that you need to bring along for the ride, because that kind of pushes aside this, like, oh, Tommy's just trying to replace me because this is what I do for 3 weeks out of every month. Right? Like, I take these files and I have this really long verbose process, and then I have to do some analysis and things like this. Right? So there's a people part of this as well, but it's, I think, there's the building blocks for what you're able to start to teach business users are exactly where you would want to go with data culture initiatives, or how you would engage with BI teams in business teams. These are some of the best areas for businesses to invest time, because it builds efficiencies. It starts to train teams how to look at their data sets, ask the right questions, and then drive away from all the manual work, right? I'm not suggesting that Excel doesn't have its place, because it absolutely does. It has, it will. Like, it's the go-to for quick analysis, for updating data, for getting your head around things, which you would want to do before you're going to go build a Power BI report for insights and all this other stuff first anyway. It's just teaching users that that's not the end place anymore, right? It's just a data input if need be, or when they're thinking about bringing this new insight that they did in an ad hoc analysis fashion through Excel, the next path is, great, I've done all this stuff. Now I know how to get it to this next level where I can automate it. I can have this report just available for everybody. And I'm shedding this responsibility off onto systems that are designed to support it. And my impact is exponential, right? And this is why I think in this microcosm of Excel to Power BI, people have found immense success in Power BI being the thing in organizations because it's a multiplier, right? If I'm so good at analysis in Excel, I can magnify my value to the business by learning these automation steps in my process in Power BI because I'm automatically delivering these insights without manual intervention. So everything I know about my business area gets bigger and better, and people see that, and that's why technologies explode because they're multipliers.
Mm-hmm. I like that point. I like your point around the value is in the analysis. It's the thinking critically about the data and getting out of it what you want to make decisions on later on in the business. That's the value add. It's not I'm removing this column, scrubbing out this data. I'm replacing these values. Like that shouldn't be a thing anymore. Like that's such a low hanging fruit. It's like an automatable thing. Yeah, I like that a lot. That's a great question to ask. Sorry, back to your question, Tommy. I know you were kind of pushing on people. Like, maybe rephrase your question. Does this change your question at all after these 2 points?
Honestly, what Seth said, and again, I'm going to miss that 45-minute gold nugget every single time too. So, but honestly, too, what Seth said is really the hardest thing to do because it is so much about the culture too and the people you're dealing with, Seth, to your point, where a lot of times I've gone to those Excel projects and the first thing we do before we even look at the data, before we even say what the end goal is I work with the people who have to input the data and are all part of that journey and really get a cost of time on what they're actually doing. So how much time do you spend on this on a given week or a given month? And what we really do from there is even if you don't like the report, we found out that just this team of 5 people alone will save them X amount of hours. It's going to allow the finance person to actually do finance things, so to speak. So it's really, that's one of the first major steps, not to your point, Mike, too, where Excel does have its benefits, but you don't come in guns a-blazing. Power BI is just so much better for everything. So no, look at all the things we do. And really my first mode of attack or first weapon is really those time involved. And then actually probably for the first time outlining to leadership or who I'm working with that step-by-step process that has to happen and how many hands it changes. And that's what we want to eliminate. But at the same time, and you still need the culture and the right people, right? Because people will be stuck in their ways, and not even the people who are just building that Excel report every month or on a recurring basis, but the people who like to look at it and know where it is and knows what they can manipulate. So I would always go against going into a project like this. Like, we're just going to replicate your tables and have it in Power BI. No one's going to be happy that way.
I agree.
And I think that's such a so misunderstood. It's like, no, what are you actually trying to do with this Excel report? Like, I know it has, 10 rows by 20 columns, split up with all these numbers, but are you looking at all of those all the time? Like, what are we really trying to do here? Just because, when you're trying to compete with Excel from a cell and, specific point of view, not going to work. But that first approach is really a culture change. It's more than the technology with Excel. Then you can deal with the headaches of, where'd you get that number from? Who put that in? Where'd he get that number from?
Yeah.
How did he come up with that? We can deal with that later, but we have to first just simply sell how much time and really what we're going to do from the benefit, not just, hey, it's going to be pretty visuals and it's automated. And I think that's really what makes or break those Excel projects.
In my past experiences, what has typically happened here is when you get to that very complex Excel thing, what happens is you have one or two or a handful of really skilled people on the team that are building and maintaining that Excel document. And if those people don't do their job around that Excel document, you lose the ability for the business to leverage that information over and over again. So it really, I mean, yes, Excel is extremely powerful. It can do a lot of things, but it really narrows down the knowledge base down to a very small group of people who know how to maintain and utilize that Excel document. I did put in the chat window here the article from Kurt, Data Goblins, around report requirements. One thing that I have found that works for me as a technique here is that works very successfully is stepping back and saying, help me define the inputs. What input things do you require to make the output correct? So once you do the experimentation Excel, get the Excel document thing figured out and completed, fine. But to your point, Seth, let's step back and say, what is the real value that we're producing throughout this sheet or Excel document? Define what are the inputs. These are the areas where I'm injecting information. These are the sources of data. And then you step back and say, what of those can be automated? Is there anything in those places where we can automate that information so it becomes regularly loaded into the Excel document? Another point around this one is a lot of times I see Excel documents looking at a very small window of data across an organization or a very summarized version of data. When you get to Power BI, I think you can add more data to the scope of what you're looking at. So I also think there's a volume scale here as well that shifts your mindset away from users just thinking about their customer, their one little scenario, and things you had to do, cheats you had to take around the data previously, you don't necessarily have to do anymore. There is a better way of absorbing more data into one analysis, and you can actually report across more. So I use the analogy a lot of times when we look at these things, a lot of people aren't thinking critically of the data and saying, do I need all the data to show up? Or do I really just need, I think of Excel and or the data model as one really large table. Well, the entirety of the table isn't relevant all the time. What you're looking at is for where the performance of those couple customers impacted your bottom line. You're looking for the edge cases of the data. Where does the data not fit your expectations? That's a lot of what we're doing in our analysis is trying to figure out what are those groupings or what is the logical grouping of data points that get us to the number like, wow, I wasn't expecting that number to be so low in revenue for these 6 customers. I was expecting it to be much higher. Then you dig in and go figure out what happened. Did we lose a customer? Did we lose some sales? Did we give a price increase and the customer didn't like it and bought somewhere else? Like all these other kind of questions kind of get spurred from these aggregations of data. So really, I mean, I can't express enough. Using budget numbers and actual numbers is so important here. And I think that's a lot of what we need to get our culture around in our organizations is thinking more about that way. Anyways,
yeah,
I think about time. Final thoughts, Seth? Yeah, I was going to
say. I mean, it's all about ROI, right? And I think there are 2 ways you can help with selling an Excel to Power BI migration where it makes sense, as well as like prove the points. The first being insights, right? The fastest win is, hey, we've got all of this data. I've talked to the teams that use it. Here's the insights we can just show you on a page, right? And you can instantly get from visualizations as opposed to all of the raw data. And that is the first thing you can go build off of the Excel file, right? Is here's the new world and why we want to go down this path. Once you have that, it's a much easier path towards saying the secondary part of this that's going to take longer is in the automation of it, but it's worth it because more often than not, what you're saying is you get this data refreshed faster than it was in the past. Meaning, like these are probably reports in the data that is coming out of it that's extremely important for the business to make decisions on, which is why they're going to invest a bunch of time in creating efficiencies. But in that automation process with business users, essentially the feedback to the business should be, yes, we're building an efficiency, but we're also building future efficiencies, because what you should be doing is training the teams and saying to the business, we're teaching these teams how to not put us in this situation again. And they're going to be able to automate their solutions. They're going to be able to create more value for the business. And that's what you're doing alongside of just this one-off process where it's like, I'm going to take, 6 weeks to work with a team to save you 3 weeks, per month. So like that trade-off, or you get, equilibrium after 2 or 3 months. Yes. But in the interim, you should be seeing the results of this work in other areas, in other more productive, things that those teams are doing. And that's kind of how, the tide raises all ships when you go through and can spend time with these teams and train them how to use these new tools, because it's an accelerator for them and it's a value add to the business.
I like it. Tom, any final thoughts as you kind of wrap here?
Honestly, Seth, my final thought is I'm going to miss you, and I'm going to have a lot of thoughts about you in the coming weeks and months. That's all I got.
I made Tommy speechless.
I'm pretty bummed about this, knowing this is coming. But Mike, what we should do with all this AI stuff is we should get all the transcripts from all of our podcasts.
Oh boy, AI Seth.
Just AI
Seth AI. We're gonna train it. We'll have to get a Seth AI prompted on all the thoughts and ways of Seth. Train it into a model.
Need to talk to an IP lawyer here.
Yeah, that's funny. You always agree with Mike's points nowadays. What's going on? That's awesome. Well, we want to say thank you very much, Seth, for all your time on the podcast. It's been a pleasure and an enjoyment. It's just always talking with you and hanging out and discussing things. You always bring great insights to the table. We really appreciate that as well. Best of luck on your new adventures on things, and you're always welcome back on the podcast as a perpetual, always on guest if you'd ever want to come back. So we really appreciate your time. Best of luck on your new adventures. That being said, we do appreciate every one of your listeners out here. You guys are awesome, a great community of people, engaging, adding a lot of conversation in the chat. So thank you, chat, very much today for also participating, add your thoughts, and hearing how this may impact you as well. With that being said, we really do appreciate you and the podcast. We would love it if you would let somebody else know you are enjoying it. Go listen to it on your daily run or whatever other medium you like to use our podcast on. We appreciate it, and we thank you very much for your time. Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You can find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. Make sure to subscribe and leave a rating. It helps us out a ton. Do you have a friend, or do you have a question, an idea, or a topic that you want us to talk about? I feel like we're going to see a lot more mailbags coming in soon, and they're going to have the same tone. Well, you can submit it on powerbi.tips/podcast. Leave your name and your great question. And finally, join us live every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central, and join the conversation on all of Power BI Tips social media channels.
Thank you all very much, and we'll see you on Thursday.